Well, I'm glad to speak to you all at this event of the dead of winter about something exciting, which is um, flowers and pollinators. And so this talk is not the definitive talk on pollinators or flowers. I can only do a certain amount. So I've tried to pick some of the highlights, as you'll see, and you'll see what my purpose is as we go along. So let's see if I can get started here. I have the subjects I've chosen to enumerate are uh, mostly coastal, uh, since that's the chapter that invited me. But you folks from the mountains and where and everywhere, the principles are the same, and some of the plants will be the same. So don't fret. Flowers and their pollinators of the green swamp region.
Larry,
Yes.
could you stop for just a moment? I've got the Zoom says people are trying to come in, but it says it's limited to 100, and I don't know why that is. I'm going to see if I can find out, unless anybody knows how to up the limit from 100. I'm going to.
Unless you have the there's certain Zoom programs that allow 100 and then a 300 and then up from that. So you might be stuck with the 100, which is the lowest level.
Yeah, I may have. I paid for it, so I don't know why, but I guess short of having to upgrade,
Yeah, now that when you advertise more widely.
Yeah,
I'm going to move along.
Go ahead then, Larry. Sorry.
So just to orient some of you, whether you've ever been there or not, to the green swamp region of North Carolina. It's down in the southeast corner. Southport is here. Up here you go to Wilmington. Boiling Springs Lakes is a famous place. Bolivia, US 17. And then the heart of this region is the Green Swamp Preserve, which is a 20,000 acre preserve, but oodles of land of all mixed uses all around. The famous place to go if you've never been and want to go is along Highway 211, North Carolina 211, right about there. There's a little 1 acre pond or borrow pit there where you can park. The Nature Conservancy owns a place there. It's called Shoestring Savannah. And just across the street is an area called Big Savannah. These are some of the finest places in the green swamp you can just drive up to and get out and walk through. One of the most remarkable places on earth. Because down in this region of South Carolina, there are more different kinds of plants, especially carnivorous plants, than almost anywhere in the world outside of the tropics. And so this is a famous place. There are almost 20 species of carnivorous plants in this greater green swamp area. One of the ways to get to know this area, if you don't know this book by the late, his name is obliterated down here, Orchids, Carnivorous Plants, and Other Wildflowers of the Green Swamp, Jim Fowler. This is probably the finest little wildflower guide to the plants of this region. And so I encourage you to see if you can get a copy if you like that sort of thing. Well, plant watching has become a very popular pastime. And so more and more people are out doing it. And I understand the Southeast Coast chapter is going on a hike sooner or later, somewhere out into the green swamp. You might be going there to the Shoestring Savannah area. But what I hope to do today is to kind of prepare you for how to look at plants perhaps in a slightly different way than you have. And that is to not just look at the flowers, but to think about their pollinators. And when you see an array of plants in nature in a meadow, like a savanna, a grassy savanna would be, to wonder to yourself and out loud and among yourselves, how are the plants interacting out there? All of these flowers are blooming. There must be a method to the madness. And what you'll find is that, yes, plants are competing with each other for space. They're competing with each other for the all-important pollinators. And so they do different things to attract pollinators. And that's kind of part of my purpose today. I don't know when or where your field trip is going to be, but be sure you take plenty of insect repellent or the mosquitoes will carry you off. The majority of the places where so many flowers grow are called variously pine savannas or savannas or coastal bogs or pitcher plant bogs. And it's a real treat to go to these places and see the great diversity of plants through the year. So I've tried to, in a fairly crude way, to arrange some of the plants I'm talking about from early to late through the year, just to have a bit of organization to it. I want to first do a little educational promotion. That's not the right word. a little education event to talk about the plant life cycle, which is so important to understand. There are 4 stages in the life cycle of every plant. The flowering stage, which is when sexual reproduction takes place. And so you've got flowers are produced usually for a very brief period, and then pollination has to take place. Successful pollination results in fruits with seeds. This is very important because this is how the next generation gets started. And then these ripe fruits, in one way or another, have to be dispersed out into the environment, and seedlings have to be established. And thank goodness they don't all survive, but a certain number of them do, to replenish the parents as time goes on. And these seedlings that do land in the right space, that have the right conditions, will grow to maturity and carry on life until the next event of sexual reproduction. For most plants, it's once a year. Mature plants tend to bloom once a year, and they go from there. The ultimate goal is for pollen to get from one flower to another flower to effect cross-pollination. That's what flowers are, and that's what insects and other pollinators are there to participate in that role. And of course, pollen, except for the wind-blown pollen that we all know about, and I'll talk about briefly later, most pollen is sticky, and it sticks to the various insects and animals that come to visit the flowers. And this is not an accident. The plants have made their pollen sticky so that it can be easily carried. And of course, there is no free lunch. You have to pay for the use of insects. So many insects eat the pollen or drink nectar that they make, or otherwise gain some benefit from this act of cross-pollination. I'll just briefly remind you that a flower is the organ of the plant made of modified leaves that effects cross-pollination. And you've got the green sepals, the colorful petals, the male stamens that make pollen, and the female pistil that has eggs down in here that get fertilized to make seeds. And flowers then are beautiful to us. The plant does not care whether we enjoy their flowers or not, but we happen to, because these flowers are colorful and sometimes they're fragrant. But the flowers are there, keep in mind, for the purpose of cross-pollination. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. This is a non-native plant. I've tried to stick to natives today pretty much, as you'll see. This is a non-native lily, but it shows off the problem that flowers have. You know, they might bloom beautifully and have big flowers and plenty of pollen and stigmas, but how do you get the pollen from the anther to the stigma? It doesn't get there itself. So some kind of animal, insects or hummingbirds, have to visit. Otherwise, the pollen just falls on the ground, so to speak. And here, a little bit of pollen has gotten on the stigma. So some appropriate animal that we'll learn about is involved in making this happen. These are just some pretty pictures of plant stigmas, with pollen grains on them. You see the pollen grains very small compared to the female stigma. And these pollen grains have to match. People often ask, how does the plant know? How does the pine lily know that it has pine lily pollen on its stigmas? And the way plants know that the right thing is happening is chemicals. So this stigma detects the chemicals in the pollen grain and knows that it's the right pollen grain, and it'll, then let the pollen grain grow down through the style and fertilize the eggs. If it's not the right pollen, it won't grow. These chemicals are the same chemicals that when they get in your nose, give you hay fever. The chemicals on the pollen grains that help with species recognition. So here's a little bit of pollen over here on these hairy stigmas. So this is just a close-up. So I encourage you to carry around a magnifying glass. Buy your children some inexpensive magnifying glasses. Encourage them to look at flowers up close, to look for pollen when it is shed, to look for pollen grains on stigmas. This pollen usually only lasts a day, and the whole event of pollination in a given flower only lasts a day. There are plenty of exceptions to that, but that's the normal rule. And so flowers are designed to link up with pollinators. The purpose of these flowers, the color, the shape, the size, the markings, the form, whether they're fragrant, whether there's nectar, all of the aspects of the flower are there for a purpose in each species of plant, and that is to help the right pollinator find its right flower, because not every insect can pollinate every flower. I hope that'll become evident today as well. So, agents of cross-pollination. These are wind. There's a certain amount of wind-pollinated trees, pine trees, and oaks, hickories, maples, elms, ash. Those kinds of trees in the forest are almost all, not completely all, but almost all wind-pollinated. Then there are insects, beetles, flies, bees, butterflies, and moths. And there's some subcategories here we'll look at. And then there are hummingbirds. In the tropics, bats are important for pollinating flowers, but not here. In some parts of the world, other weird things happen. You may have mammals that do a little bit of pollinating, but not much. And that certainly doesn't happen here. So today we're going to look at examples of these pollinating agents and how they fit into their flowers. At the risk of getting too confusing, I have created these charts that I used to use in teaching, and I'll email. I don't know how to get these to you. I can email them to Charlie, I guess, and you can contact him if you want a copy. These are simply, you can make this yourself at home. It's a chart to help you keep up with pollination syndromes. A syndrome, as you know, is a group of characters that goes together in a certain event, like you have a cold. And so sneezing, sniffles, coughing, runny eyes, aches and pains, those are part of the syndrome that indicates that you have a cold. So down this side of the chart are the different pollinators: beetles, flies, bees, birds, moths. And across the top are different traits of the flowers, whether they bloom in day or night, the size of the flower, whether they give pollen or nectar, whether they have a landing platform, whether they're whether they have fragrance and the colors and the nectar guides and the shapes. We'll see all of these. You can fill in your chart, because each of these pollinators has a unique set of traits in the flower that they're looking for. You could carry this around with you as a, I don't know, a fun thing to do if you like to keep up with data. So I'm going to show you some of the preliminarily, before we get into the gallery of plants and pollinators, some things to look for when you are looking at flowers. How would you describe a flower to someone? How would you describe a flower to an insect? What are the insects looking at? So nectar guides are the colors and the patterns in the flower that to insects look a little different than they might to us. Insects might see these with more ultraviolet reflection, but they're like the landing, they're like the markings on the runway for airplanes to land. The yellow stripes, the red stripes, the turn here, the turn there. All these markings help the insect find their way to the center of the flower where the male stamens and the female stigmas are. So you want to be watching for nectar guides. And then you want to look at flower shapes. So I'm going to quickly run through the 6 basic flower shapes because each one tends to correlate with a type of a pollinator. So you got bowls, bells, brushes, gullets, banners, and trumpets. And so the first thing I like to do when I go out is tell people, identify the shape of your flower. First thing, is it a bowl or a bell or a banner? And that gets you off to a good start on helping to decide what the pollinator is. So bowls are flowers that are absolutely open. Their stamens and pistils are freely evident to the world. They're flowers with no clothes on, and any insect that wants to could visit these flowers. They tend to not have a lot of, they're cheap flowers. They tend to not have a lot of pollen or a lot of nectar, and often are visited by low-level pollinators like flies. And then they're bowl. They're a bell. You go from a bowl to a bell, where the flower is a little bit more cupped, like a rhododendron, a little more enclosed. And these flowers are a little more specialized. And the pollinators that visit them have to be a little more able to maneuver inside the flower, like these rhododendrons are pollinated by bees. You can see they have nectar guides, those little spots there. Those are very important to orient the bee as to which is on the top. And the color may be important. The color may change as the flower goes through its blooming stages. Here's some bells of gentians. These happen to be closed gentians. There's an open gentian. I'm just going to see if my little video here works. So here's how a bee gets into a closed gentian. They do it with sheer strength. The bee knows there's something down in there, so she's going after it. And in this case, the flower is protecting its pollen and nectar from all pollinators except bees, because this flower has decided evolutionarily it's going to be a bee pollinated flower, and so it protects its pollen. This gentian happens to be open and more easily visited. It's fun to watch bees messing around closed gentians. Then there's the brush. The brush, like this little wild mimosa, and you're probably familiar with the invasive mimosa tree. This is where the stamens are the showiest part of the flower. Dozens and dozens of stamens. So this ball here, this powder puff ball, is actually a grouping of flowers. Each flower has 10 stamens. And so if you want to sit here and count how many stamens there are, that'll tell you how many flowers there are in that cluster. And the point is the flowers don't want to make showy petals. They just want to stick their stamens out there. And the insects that come there brush against the pollen on the stigmas that are presented and get pollen on their tummies as they're getting nectar. And then there's the gullet. I don't know, we could probably think of a better name. These are your what we call two-lipped flowers. They have two upper petals and 3 lower petals, like in this penstemon or beard tongue. Here's a kind of a side view of these gullets. And they're gullets because they're closed off in a tube, and the insect has to crawl down in that throat. and that's usually done by bees almost exclusively. So these kinds of flowers have a landing platform for the bee. Then the bee crawls inside, and while she's getting nectar, here are the stamens carefully placed up here. The flower, by the way, is in charge of all of this. The flower creates the setting, creates the shape, size, color, texture, provides the nectar and pollen, opens at a certain time, appeals to a certain insect, and then places the pollen where the flower wants it to be placed so it can be picked up by the next insect that comes into the flower. So these flowers are ingenious in their ability to, form themselves in the right way to attract and manipulate their pollinators. Just like some restaurants you go in, when you think about it, there's some restaurants, you can just walk up to the window and get a hamburger. Others, you have to go around back, go down an alley, knock on a little door. Somebody peeps through a window. You have to give them a password, and then they let you in. So that's what these flowers are kind of like that. It takes a little bit of extra effort to get in the flower. Here's some gullets. These are the Monarda that are tubular with 2 lips. So anything with 2 lips like this, conspicuous, is going to be a gullet. I love the spotted horse mint from the coast. Their little flowers are tucked under the leaves, but they're 2-lipped, upper and lower lips. The pollen is right there. So it gets on the head of the bee, big bees who visit these flowers. Then there's the banner. Banners are mostly, but not exclusively, members of the pea family, bean family. This is the everlasting pea. It's not native, but we have some native peas that do this. And the banner has this, one of its petals it makes into a kind of a flag back here. And then it has 2 little side petals and then a petal in the front. I think the next slide. Yeah, here's the pea family flower with the banner. 2 petals on the side that are called wings. And then there's a keel. And that keel folds over the stamens and hides them way down inside. So the insects that go into these flowers, here again, almost exclusively bees, have to figure out how to get into these flowers. And they have to be able to push the wings away, pull the keel down, go down inside. So talk about having to do several steps to get in here. These are the ultimate difficult to get into flowers. And the whole point is to protect that precious pollen from just any old insect. These flowers only want strong, loyal insects that can fly great distances, that are kind of long-lived, that come back to the same flower every year, that sort of thing. A good example of this that's native is the Wisteria. See, there's the banner, there's the 2 wings, and there's the keel. So if you've ever watched an insect, so here's where now you've got to start. Charlie, if you're taking these people out in a field trip, it's got to be 50% longer than you plan, so people can stop and look at the flowers and play with them and watch the insects move on them and see how the insects manipulate the flower. So you got to stop and stare and wonder what's going on with each flower. So it takes a little longer, but it's more intriguing. And then finally, you've got your trumpet. These are the long, usually red tubular flowers, usually red with a yellow throat. They're usually pollinated by hummingbirds. And so these are trumpet. They can be in the phlox family, the honeysuckle. You can have trumpets in a number of different flowers, but they almost always mean something with a long beak or a long tongue. So either a hawk moth, a butterfly, or hummingbird, but it's got to be something that can handle these little narrow trumpet tubes. Here's a related, in fact, I think all the members of the honeysuckle family are like this. Tubular flowers, red on the outside, yellow on the inside, they attract hummingbirds. And after a while, you'll get used to this. You'll be able to see these driving down the road because they're almost always bright red. So there's the basic floral forms: bowl, bell, brush, gullet, trumpet, and I've already forgotten the fifth one. Here's some examples. And you can get mixtures of these things like on the button bush. It's a series of little tubular flowers. So you have to have a long tongue to reach the nectar, but the stamens stick out here like a brush. So it's kind of a hybrid between a brush and a trumpet. And these are especially popular with butterflies. Button bush. So where's my, so just watch this for a minute. This is a button bush in its peak of bloom, discovered by a flock of tiger swallowtail butterflies. And there's a pipevine swallowtail. See how they're holding on to the ball and probing down into each flower. And as they move around, they're moving. So there must be something good about this pollen and nectar, because these butterflies are after the nectar, because these butterflies are just going crazy over the flowers. So there you go. Now, another little feature that goes with some flowers is the spur. This is one of the crested orchids that you find down in the green swamp in late summer. And each flower looks like it might be a bee flower, but it isn't, because each flower has a long spur, longer than the flower, that sticks out behind it, and that's where the nectar is. And so these things that look kind of like a gullet, and in many cases they are in orchids, are really butterfly pollinated. Let's see if I have a picture. Yeah, here's actually a moth. It could be a butterfly with a long tongue, and they can stick their tongues down into the flower, into that spur, and get nectar. And as they are doing so, here's the first time we see what's really happening. The insect, as she gets the pollen, as she gets the nectar, is also picking up pollen. And that pollen is stuck on the tongue of that moth.
Larry, we can't see anything past the butterfly because your screen has stopped advancing.
The screen has stopped advancing?
Yes. So we're still back with the button bush.
Oh my goodness.
There we go. Now the video is working. Yeah, great.
What's the video? Sorry. Thank you. That sounded like coffee. Thank you for letting me know.
It was.
I know you wouldn't sit there for an hour watching nothing. Anyway, this is the most remarkable thing I ever saw when I ran across it.
Yeah, wow.
This is why you need to have one of these in your yard or nearby at any rate, for the dynamic of what can go on. Whoopsie. So I talked about spurs on otherwise what might be a bee pollinated flower, because the flower is kind of shallow in there, but there's a spur sticking out from the base of each flower, and the nectar is in that spur. And so the animal that gets it has got to have a long tongue, and these flowers are helping, being a little anthropomorphic here. They have evolved these long hairs on their lip that I believe allows butterflies to hold on. Butterflies aren't very strong, so they hold on to those hairs. And in this case, a moth is hovering, and she is sticking her tongue down inside of that spur in order to get the nectar. And in doing so, she has picked up the pollen from the place in the flower where the placement is appropriate for the pollinator that comes here, and it's gotten stuck on the tongue there, which is probably not very comfortable, but for the moth. But I don't know, that's sort of like going into a restaurant and having somebody hit you with a pie. You ordered a pie, here's your pie, wham. So you got to walk around all day with pollen stuck on your tongue. But that's the way it works. I keep saying this must be pretty good nectar for these insects to go to this trouble to get it. And that's true. You have to have a certain quality of nectar if you want to attract a certain quality of pollinator. Now, having shown you all the examples of how of the flowers that are adapted for insects, I can simply say that many plants have reverted to a more primitive method of pollination, which is wind pollination. So like in a temperate zone forest in the spring where all the leaves are gone, is a good time for the trees to shed pollen and cross-pollinate themselves when the leaves are not in the way, those pesky leaves. And so you might say, well, if there are 10 species of trees in that forest or 10 species of grasses in this meadow, how do they pollinate themselves with all that pollen blowing around? And there are two answers. One is they're very time specific. Each species will bloom a certain week. So as we'll see later around here, red maple comes first, maybe then elm, maybe then tag alder. Those are early. And then later in the spring, other species, each week a new species blooms, and the other species have finished blooming. And so there's less chance of stray pollen getting on stigmas. So deciduous forest and grasslands or meadows are good places to find wind pollination. Here's some wind pollinated trees, oak, and this is a birch. And the flowers are not showy because wind doesn't care about pretty flowers. And your elm flowers. Around here, I think elms bloom almost at the drop of a hat when it gets warm enough. And it's all this pollen that causes hay fever because of the proteins on the pollen grains that help identify. That's the other way the trees know where their pollen is if they're getting the right pollen, because they only allow their species of pollen to effectively fertilize their eggs. That's another whole talk. So an evolutionary lesson. Insects are more efficient than wind. The plants don't need to dump as much pollen into the air. But the other side of the coin is the flowers are competing, as I mentioned, for pollinators. So if they're all blooming at the same time, how do they get, quote unquote, the right pollinator to visit them? And that's what this story is all about. And it goes back to the traits that the flowers have developed that help match the pollinator to the flower, to the plant. Flowers also give away, they don't have just physical traits, they have food value, I guess you could say. And so the rewards that flowers offer is pollen. And so here's a bee. This may just be a honeybee, but it's a good representative of a bee. This bee has collected pollen enough to where she has much pollen in her saddlebags on her legs, and that becomes food back at the hive. And then many flowers, not all by any means, not all flowers make nectar, but some flowers make a really good quality nectar. And this is needed as fuel for flying by hummingbirds. All insects need a certain amount of fuel. So hummingbirds, butterflies, moths, bees, all have to go to some flowers that have nectar. So this milkweed seems to be overjoyed in producing an abundance of nectar here in its little nectar horns. And so it gets many insects to come and visit during the time the flowers are open. And so I'm back to that chart that I showed you. I can send this to Charlie, or you can review this video. This is the chart all filled out for each pollinator, what the traits are that the different flowers express, the syndrome, the collection of traits that helps you, the observer, to match up a certain insect, pollinator, bird with a certain flower. Don't try to memorize this chart. So I'm going to start with a gallery through the year of examples of flowers that I sort of chose at random, but not necessarily. Some of these are my favorites, the ones I have pictures of. And I did take a certain number of these pictures off the internet. I've tried to identify photographers when I can, but there are a lot of great pictures on the internet that are available that can be used for educational purposes like this. And so I've started with witch hazel, and I don't know whether one of you might have an opinion on this, whether witch hazels bloom at the end of the year or the beginning of the year. Are they the last plants to bloom, or are they the first plants to bloom? They tend to bloom in November and December. But at any rate, I chose to go with them first as a way of starting in the dead of winter and moving forward. So witch hazels are, they have these spidery flowers. They're bowls. They're quite open, and anything can go in here. And these are almost exclusive. I didn't mean it. These are almost exclusively pollinated by flies that come out on cool days, perhaps after bees have hibernated. So these, you'll see more than anything, you'll see flies on witch hazel. But they do a pretty good job of cross-pollinating because you always get a few fruits. These are the seed pods here. And there are 4 seeds inside of each of those pods. And then something that nobody ever pays any attention to is the poor mistletoe. You see them up there in the tree, unless one falls down, you never get a chance to examine it. So I'm suggesting when you do get a chance to examine some mistletoe that you do examine it. And these also tend to bloom November, December, perhaps into early January. It's the early ones that make the berries that we see at Christmas when we use them at Christmas time. And these are these fat white berries. And these are the little flowers. They're little yellow flowers, hardly noticeable. And you might not even think that they're insect pollinated, except they are. And they're usually males on one plant, females on another, so they have to be cross-pollinated. Here again, these are fly pollinated because the flowers are small, shallow, don't offer very much, and just barely get by. So be thankful for flies. Especially the mistletoe thanks you. In January to February, there's virtually no native wildflowers blooming. Our plants know that it's winter and it's cold and they've gone dormant and they're not going to pop up on a warm day. I should have shown the earliest blooming wildflower, but since it's not coastal, I didn't. That is skunk cabbage. It can often open on a warm February day if it's in the sun, and it is fly pollinated. You'll just have to look that up on your own. The closest to the coast that I know of skunk cabbage is in the Yadkin Valley, Yadkin River Valley, back in on the edge of the Piedmont and the Sandhills. So you can go there to the what's the state park down at the end of southern North Carolina and the Yadkin Valley drainage. There's a great little state park there that has lots of skunk cabbage. If you want to see flowers in the wintertime, you have to use cultivated plants that come from a warmer climate. And so just to show you that there are such, I've picked out a few. Winter sweet, pollinated by flies, blooms in December and January, very fragrant, nice plant to have in your yard. In January and February is the Japanese cloud cherry from the warmer places in the far east that bloom then. And then starting about 2 weeks ago in my yard are Lenten rose that come from the warmer Mediterranean region. So if you want flowers in your garden in the winter, they have to be non-natives. And almost all of these are pollinated by flies and the occasional honeybee that might come out on a warm winter day. So these plants are out of context. They're out of their natural element. So then you start in February as it gets warmer of native woody plants, trees and shrubs that start pollinating.
You just click your space bar if you want.
Realize these buds that are blooming in February were there. They were made last summer.
How do I see people?
So here's male red maple and female red maple, and you can see the stigmas. And there's the these stamens with pollen, and these are wind dispersed. But they also honeybees visit these to get pollen. Apparently, it's an important source of pollen for cultivated honeybees in the wintertime. Tag alder is one of the earliest to bloom. The pollen comes out of these dangling catkins, they're called, where lots and lots and lots of pollen. And these are the female flowers up here. See, they're not very showy. And then an elm, lots of stamens shedding lots of pollen, and you know they don't have pretty petals. They don't. Although I gotta admit, red maple's kind of pretty. One of the earliest then of our native wildflowers to bloom is Pixie Moss. If you've never seen Pixie Moss, you need to go see Pixie Moss. That needs to be on your bucket list. At my age, I have a teacup list because I've seen about all the things I'm capable of seeing. But whether you're young or old, you should go out and find some Pixie Moss. It grows there in the green swamp at Shoestring Savanna. It's also well known, although rare, over in the sand hills and some of the pine forests. And Will Stewart and I went out to see these one either late February, early March. And Pixie Moss only grows an inch from the ground, and its flowers are bigger than the plant. Here's the little leaves. And Will has discovered these are pollinated by a little butterfly that comes out this time of year. Not very many people go out and look at Pixie Moss in the wintertime, but it's not a moss, although it looks like one. And it's abundant there at the Shoestring Savanna area before you go into the Pocosin that leads to the bog. Similarly, blooming at about the same time of around the 1st of March would be trailing arbutus. They can actually grow with Pixie Moss in some places. They like rough edges, well-drained, sandy soil, even rocky places. And trailing arbutus can be white or pink or dark pink, other colors. It's a creeping shrub in the rhododendron family. It's fun to find. It's worth going. So if y'all know where some of this is down in your coastal area, you should go out to see it. These are easily seen down in South Carolina at the National Sand Hills National Wildlife Refuge down near McBee. If you want to go down there sometime, they're fun to find. These are very fragrant. You use your nose to find them. The Pixie Moss, I don't think has much of an odor. I don't know how you find them. As spring moves along, you will see Damasco Lily, one of our most beautiful wild lilies. They're not really lilies, they're really in the Amaryllis family, but that doesn't matter too much. They grow in the edges of wet places, and they can grow in the woods. They can grow in the ditches. They can grow out in a little bit of sun. They're beautiful. And the fact that they are tubular flowers, kind of hard to see on some of these tubular flowers with notches between the petals. That's a wide open flower, and these are fragrant at night. These are pollinated by moths. So a white flower, fragrant at night or blooming at night, is invariably pollinated by a hawk moth. Now, yes, in the daytime, a butterfly might try to visit, wouldn't be out of the question. But these plants evolved as nighttime moth pollinated. Certainly beautiful. Each flower lasts about a day, maybe 2 days, not very long. And also, as spring turns into early summer, the coastal spider lilies along wet ditches, all along the Highway 17 and back roads, wherever there are wet ditches, you'll find the Hymenocallis crassipes, the coastal spider lily. These flowers last one day. They actually last one night because they bloom at night. And the flowers are pretty large, almost some of them as wide as the palm of your hand or wider. And they're characterized by having this membrane that connects the stamens. Nobody knows what that's for. Maybe it helps reflect light. In fact, that's probably the original, like the original flower, and the petals that have grown out longer than that to help act as a kind of a sign, help reflect more light for night flying. Like here's a hawk moth that is coming and hovering and sticking her tongue down inside the long tubular flowers. These are very long tubular flowers, so they have lots of nectar down in there. It takes an animal with a long tongue to suck it out. That'd be like you're drinking a milkshake with a 6-foot piece of garden hose. Because these girls' tongues are as long as they are, and they keep them coiled up. So you'd have to carry around with you a 6-foot garden hose every time you wanted to drink a Coca-Cola out of a bottle. You'd have to stick that tube in that bottle to get the Coke out. That's what they have to go through. Thank these hawk moths. Also, as spring moves along, you get into the arums. The arums have tiny little flowers that are not very showy. This is the green arum, wild arum. And these are related to our jack-in-the-pulpit. And if you cut open some jack-in-the-pulpit flowers, you'll find the little tiny female or male flowers are down inside of that tube, protected and hidden from sight. And these are pollinated by flies. I don't know whether you can see, but they're little flies and gnats. I put those in the same category. So the flies have to go first to some male flowers, and they have to go to a structure with female flowers to cross-pollinate. And the arums work the same way. Their flowers are protected down inside that folded leaf. So these occur in wetlands, ditches that are kind of shady, they don't like super full sun. But here's a challenge for you down in the green swamp, and that is to find the white arum. I have seen it down there in wet places on back roads throughout the green swamp. They bloom in late spring, and their folded leaf called a spay, they're showy, they're white instead of being green. And so they're much more worth looking at, so to speak, from our point of view. And unlike the green arum, which makes green fruits, these make beautiful bright red fruits. So here's some of their seed pods ripening later in the summer with red seeds, and these are eaten by birds who like red things, and that's how they get around. So you never know what's going to pollinate something, what's going to disperse something. You have to kind of analyze what would be the most likely pollinator based on these syndromes. And because of the tiny flowers that are hidden down in here, it turns out to be flies. Other fly pollinated things in late winter, early spring, as the weather permits, is sassafras. You know, sassafras has characteristic leaves, mittens, lobe, 1 lobe, 2 lobes. And if you're lucky enough to live near a female sassafras, you can see the beautiful berries in the early fall. The birds eat these almost as soon as they ripen. But in the spring, it's more casual to go out and watch them bloom. And the flowers open, and down inside are these glistening glands of nectar that not a whole lot, but some, and these are visited by flies. So here again, late winter when it's still cold, flies tend to be your pollinators, and they go to these simple, open, bowl-shaped flowers. Similarly, and closely related is spice bush. They bloom in late winter or early spring, as you might want to call it. These are visited by whatever's out there that time of year, mostly flies. I have seen honeybees out there on a warm day, and here's an actual wasp. I shouldn't have to say, here's a wasp visiting the flowers of spice bush. They come out on warm days. And so the spice bush doesn't really care what pollinates it. It has open, simple flowers and is there at that time of year, avoiding the mad rush of pollination that comes along a little bit later. I love to go out and look for pawpaw fruits in low woods. They occur all throughout the region. And they have large brownish flowers that smell kind of musty, but they're pollinated by flies. Their musty smell and their dark color is perhaps reminiscent of dead meat. I don't know. Could be, but these tend to be fly and gnat pollinated. Even though they have lots of pollen and stigmas, these have the lowest percent of effective pollination of most of any normal plants that have been studied. In other words, lots of insects visit it, but not a lot of fruit is set. And here are the fruits that are produced, the pawpaw fruits. These are becoming very popular these days. I know several people that are planting little plantations of pawpaw because these fruits are so valuable. You know, they're used for, people want them for microbreweries to flavor beer. And the last time I tried to buy some, they were $10 a pound. So plant some pawpaws. And I'm intrigued. My whole career I have spent chasing around trying to seed the dwarf paw paw, Semina parviflora. These little flowers look very much like big pawpaw. They bloom early. They bloom on buds that come on the stems that are not part of the new growth. And they're cross-pollinated by flies, and they turn into little pawpaw fruits. They're just not as big as regular pawpaws. So watch for these. I have seen these in dryish woods down in, I don't know the name of the woods, down in the Leland area down near Wilmington, at a famous herb nursery whose name I can't think of. You all who live down there will know that nursery. She specialized in herbs and other plants, native plants. If you walk back through her woods, you'll see many of these plants that grow in upland woods, pawpaws and dwarf pawpaw and sweet shrubs and things like that.
Meg Shelton is the name.
Out in the open roadside, sandy, dryish, you'll find Chickasaw plum, sometimes called Cherokee plum. These are several species, sometimes difficult to identify, of wild plums that bloom early and only last a few days, but are highly visited by pollinators, which tells you they're highly sought after at that time of year. This is a beautiful sight to see. When you see these big masses of white shrubs out in the field, stop and go look at them, see what kind of insects are there. The coastal rhododendron azalea, coastal azalea, rhododendron atlanticum, blooms early. They grow out in the shrubby precosins. These are the low precosins where you get knee to waist high shrubs. These can be white to pink. They're very, 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 very fragrant. They attract butterflies. And if there were a hummingbird up that early in the year, they might even attract a hummingbird. Their flowers are tubular, and butterflies hold on to the notches between the petals. They're not bee pollinated because the stamens stick out too far. The bees wouldn't fit into the flower. They also come in white. They're very fragrant at night, so they probably are visited also by hawk moths. A little bit later in the spring, early summer, the swamp azaleas are extremely fragrant, and especially at night. And these are definitely moth pollinated at night. Long tubular flowers. The moths either hover or they hold on to the notches. So you can do pollination studies at night. Go out with a little flashlight. And these hawk moths will come whizzing by your head and almost bump into you. I guess you know that spring is here when the yellow jessamine blooms. These are slightly fragrant, very showy evergreen vines. They have bell-shaped flowers. Bees love to go in there, but so do butterflies. And so you'll get a variety of visitors on your yellow jessamine. So if you're growing a garden, plant one of these near, maybe on a fence, and enjoy the early parade of pollinators that comes with the first really good warm spells that cause these to. And you have heard, and I think it's true, that the nectar is poisonous to us humans, but apparently not to the animals. So don't let that fool you. Don't let what animals eat be a guide for what you are to eat. Calycanthus, or sweet shrub, is a very famous and well-known plant throughout the region. Dryish upland woods. They don't bloom too early, but mid-spring, their little maroon flowers open up. They have an interesting pollination mechanism. They're pollinated by little beetles. We haven't said much about beetles, but beetles are good pollinators. They pollinate magnolias, and they pollinate some primitive flowers like this sweet shrub. The little beetle goes inside the flower in the evening. People ask me, why doesn't my sweet shrub be fragrant? And I say, it is fragrant, but only an hour or so before dark. That's when it's attracting its little beetles that come to that fragrance. And the little beetle goes inside the flower and spends the night there eating these little food bodies that are produced on the stamens. And the next morning, the flower opens back up to let the beetle out, at which time the flower sheds all this pollen. And so the beetle leaves, they leave this party covered with pollen, and the next evening they go to another sweet shrub flower when the fragrant call goes out, and they spend the night in another flower. And effective, successful cross-pollination by these beetles results in a nice little seed pod full of a dozen or so big seeds. And so not only are the flowers fun to look at, the seeds are fun for kids especially, because the only way this seed pod opens up is for a mouse to chew it open in the wintertime to get the seeds out. They don't open naturally. Spring is the time for the red buckeye. These grow in the maritime forest down near, they can actually tolerate salt spray. So they'll be in the forest right down near the coast, along with the opine hollies and the osmanthus and the wax myrtles and those sorts of things. So these open very early, and they're really harbingers of spring, and they are among the first flowers at the coast to greet hummingbirds as they fly north. Columbines, which are really good hummingbird flowers, don't naturally grow at the coast, although people may plant them there now. That's another good point, is in this day and age, where so many people have moved into native habitats and planted so many plants that didn't naturally grow there, either native or non-native, in a way that a lot more animals are making a living who wouldn't make a good living there. Because before humans moved into all those spaces, some of these plants were rarer and harder to find. But so I guess that's a little bit of a shred of silver lining to development, is it allows some animals to make a better living than they may have earlier. Carl, while we're on hummingbirds, I'll just show you some of the hummingbird plants I picked out. we've talked about the trumpets that hummingbirds like to visit. And if you look at it, these red buckeye flowers are little trumpets, long tubular flowers with good nectar down inside there. And the honeysuckle are bigger trumpets. And if you want to grow one of these, you might want to get one of the selections that blooms all summer. You'll have hummingbirds all summer long. Otherwise, these are mostly spring bloomers. And their cohorts are these large flowered members of the Bignonia family, the cross vine and the trumpet vine, which blooms all summer. I think the trumpet vine is the mainstay of hummingbirds down through the ages because they grow out in the open. They bloom all summer with pretty good quantities of nectar, and they bloom right on into the fall, which hummingbirds need. So while I wouldn't plant one of these, I would enjoy them in the wild and realize that they're important for hummingbirds. As the summer goes on, I love to go looking for coral bean. These are members of the legume family that normally have banners, keels, and wings, but these have modified such that their banners, keels, and wings are formed so that they're tubular trumpet flowers for hummingbirds. And so here's an example of where a member of a family that's stereotyped as a bee pollinated has broken away from the pack and decided that they wanted to, they didn't decide, but this specialization of having a red tubular hummingbird flower is something that has given them a different way of getting pollinated in the wild other than from bees. These are beautiful plants, easy to grow. They have beautiful red seeds. They bloom all summer. They like very dry soil. They grow on the edges of sand dunes and parking lots and things. And they're getting wiped out by development. So you should plant one of these in the yard. The more traditional pea flower, which the vast majority of the legume family chose, is on the sandhills lupin that you would find especially in the sandhills, but bleeding over into, they grow in almost pure sand with longleaf pine as a cone. And these flowers show the banner, the two wings, and the keel that is so traditional in legume flowers, and require bees to push down the petals in order to get at the nectar that's hidden down inside. And normally, as these flowers bloom, this nectar guide here will change colors. It first opens fresh as white, and as they get pollinated, they turn reddish, which is not very visible, not as visible to bees. And so the bees know they've already been pollinated. So you should look for that. These bloom very early, like before May in the sandhills. From midsummer on, throughout the whole region, are cardinal flower. Everyone should have a cardinal flower, I guess, in their some damp place in their yard or in a pot, because they're the classic hummingbird flower. And hummingbirds, and they're long blooming. They bloom up the stem for weeks. And the hummingbirds come as they stick their beaks in there to get the nectar from those long tubes. Pollen is rubbed on their little heads, and they carry pollen from flower to flower. Now, to show you that that's a kind of a specialization, I have this not very great, but good enough picture of a butterfly trying to be a hummingbird, in that she's trying to visit a cardinal flower, which is better suited for hummingbirds and not so well suited for butterflies. It makes an excellent point in that in the wild. You know, we can sit here all day and make our little charts of pollination syndromes and say what flowers have traits that are attracted to what pollinators and what fits into the flower and what goes to which flower and why. And then you go out into the wild and you see exceptions to that. And so these animals do what they have to. Just like sometimes you may go eat a hamburger, whereas otherwise you might only eat filet mignon. And so try to find your way through a fast food restaurant if you're not used to it. And so these butterflies are having a little bit of trouble figuring out how to get the nectar. So I've seen countless examples of an insect you wouldn't expect to find, or even a hummingbird you wouldn't expect to find getting nectar from something. And so they just go do it. If they can get the nectar, they get it. And that's kind of the case of the Gaillardia here. The beach blanket flower grows on sand dunes, beach houses here. The ocean is just across the way. These bloom all summer and they're red and yellow. And so you might say, well, red and yellow goes with hummingbird flowers, but these are not tubular. But if you look close up at the flowers, which I don't have a close-up picture, the little flowers in the middle of this composite head are they're actually little tubes. They're kind of big. And they have a lot of nectar in there. And so a hummingbird would probably get some pretty good nectar out of a Gaillardia. Another good flower for your garden, but only in very well drained sandy soil. Anything that grows on a sand dune isn't going to grow in potting soil and be happy about it. Here again, we have to keep coming back. We can't forget beetles. Beetles are low level, do a little bit of pollinating, not big time, but you see them on flowers and therefore you have to account for them. Are they just walking around eating the flower or eating some pollen or eating some nectar, or are they being effective pollinators? Well, they're not terribly effective pollinators because they're not hairy and they don't carry a lot of pollen, but they might do a little bit. They were probably the first pollinators 200 million years ago when the first plants with pollen needed cross-pollinating. So have a little more respect for beetles and don't avoid looking at them. Some of them are quite pretty. Same with flies. We tend to brush flies out of the way, so to speak. Flies go to very simple open flowers. They like clusters of flowers. They like flowers that may not smell good or look good, but they do carry on cross-pollination. They're very good in members of the carrot family, like this Queen Anne's lace, where there are lots of flowers. They can just walk around and kind of graze. And as you may know, Queen Anne's lace and some of our native flowers in the carrot family have a purple flower right in the middle of the inflorescence. That's a decoy to help attract other insects there, we think. That's our human interpretation of that. One purple flower makes it look like some other insects are there, and so that'll attract more insects to come to the inflorescence. Studies have shown that tends to be the case. Flower flies or sweat bees, they come to you, walk up your legs and lick up sweat because maybe they like the liquid, maybe they like the salt. They don't sting. They're really flies. They look like little bees, but they're really flies. And they go around and visit flowers. They do a little bit of pollinating. But the greatest flies for pollinators that we hardly ever talk about or look at are the bee flies, the bombyliid flies. These are hairy little creatures, not very endearing. You probably wouldn't want one for a pet. They have two wings, long legs. They're kind of gangly. They're kind of awkward, but they have long tongues. And so they visit small flowers that have lines and stripes and just enough nectar for them to get by. Here's one over here visiting a colic root flower where they can go along and get a little bit of nectar where other insects might not find it worth their time. The bombyliid flies do find it worth their time, and so they're quite useful along those lines. So pay more attention to them. I especially love this notion that one year I was down at the coast in a pine forest trying to avoid getting stung by the stinging nettles there, the Nidoscolus plants. And here I find they're pollinated by these little bombyliid flies. They can kind of hover over the flower stick their little tongues down in there and get what little bit of nectar might be there. So that gave me, so now I go out of my way looking for bombyliid flies to see what they might be. They pollinate the little bluets, and they pollinate forget-me-nots, and they pollinate all kind of little tiny flowers with small openings that they can fit their slender tongues in. I threw this picture in just to have a picture of a zebra swallowtail. There's the photographer. This came off the internet. It's a rare treat to see a zebra swallowtail. They're a little more common at the coast than they are around here, perhaps. So be watching for them, one of our more elusive butterflies. And of course, we talked about the buttonbush. They attract all kind of, what they grow from mountains to the coast and attract all kind of butterflies. It's kind of hard for bees to get nectar out of these flowers, but butterflies they are adapted for. Here's something a little bit surprising, the red hibiscus and the other hibiscus down at the coast. You would think these would be hummingbird flowers because they're red, but they're not. They're not tubular. And it turns out that hibiscus are butterfly flowers, and the nectar is down in here, and the big butterflies come to these flowers, and their wings, as they flap, rub against the pollen that's emassed here in the center of the flower and get pollen on their wings, and then carry it from flower to flower. Of you've got your marshmallow, your swamp mallows, your pine mallows, your various hibiscus, your seashore mallow. These are all butterfly pollinated, different size butterflies. A hummingbird could certainly visit this flower. Even a bee could go in there and get nectar, but they're not the perfect pollinators. The perfect pollinators are like what you see on Joe Pye weed. Here again, butterflies have to take a number in order to work their way into Joe Pye weeds. And there's a great coastal Joe Pye weed that butterflies love. You can grow it, very easy to grow. These flowers are made up of many, many, many little flowers put together in little clusters. They bloom over a long period. So the butterflies have to come back every day. It's like you go to a restaurant and order a milkshake and they say, we'll give you 1/4 of your milkshake today. And tomorrow you come back, have another hamburger. We'll give you the second fourth of your milkshake. And then you come back on the 4th day, we'll give you the rest of your milkshakes. It takes you a week to have a milkshake. That's kind of what these flowers are doing. They're giving out little bits of high quality nectar. Butterflies have to come back every day. Of course, they carry more pollen that way. And here's a little hummingbird moth visiting a tulip flower because they can hover. We love these little moths, and they're definitely worth looking at. There's a brown one and a black one, 2 species. Their caterpillars eat honeysuckles, members of the honeysuckle family. And they visit tubular flowers and can hover, and they fly during the day. So they're like daytime moths that go to colorful flowers. So watch for these. They can be on almost anything. Couldn't talk about the green swamp without pitcher plants. So here's some tall yellow pitcher plant and the short purple pitcher plant. They bloom in April, May, and early June. So you kind of have to wonder what keeps pitcher plants from eating their pollinators. Well, the flowers are usually much well above the pitchers. The pitchers will definitely catch insects of all kinds. And all pitcher plants are pollinated by bumblebees. And so there she is exiting from the flower after having gone in there and gotten pollen. So pitcher plants are cross-pollinated by bumblebees. And the flowers either bloom before the pitchers open, or the flowers are well above the pitchers so that the pollinators aren't eaten during the blooming season. Now, if that same bee comes back later and wants to be eaten, she can be. They'll eat anything. It's just that during pollination time, you don't want to shoot the messenger, so to speak. You want to, it's better for your pollinators not to be harassed. Of course, the Venus flytrap is very famous in the green swamp. And for years, no one really knew what pollinated them because it hadn't been studied. These are easily bowl-shaped flowers, so any number of animals can go in those flowers. And the flowers are way above the traps down here, almost a foot tall. And sometimes the fly traps are very attractive to attract anything. They'll eat anything that gets in there. But the flowers are well above there, and it turns out that beetles and small bees are visiting these flowers, and they have to be cross-pollinated. And so small, simple pollinators apparently visit them. Now, sometime while you're out too, walking through the pitcher plant bogs, not only you're watching for pollinators, but other animals as well. So you want to look for, every time I walk by a pitcher plant, I have to stop and look in all the pitchers to see if there's a little frog in there. And I've seen a few down through the years, but this has always been my favorite picture from decades ago. Some flowers make fake pollen, and that's especially true of orchids. So you'll see down at the coast these pogonia orchids growing along wet ditches and in the savannas. And all these hairs here that look like nice yellow pollen is really fake. There's really no pollen and no nectar there. And so they're fooling the bees. Similarly, the grass pink orchid, what looks like pollen, these all look like stamens, but they're not. They're just hairs, but they fool young bees into coming there to try to get nectar and pollen. And when they land here to try to get pollen, this petal flips the bee over into the column here where they pick up pollen. And so this will happen 2 or 3 times with bees until they realize there's really no pollen there and they quit coming back. But there's always a few bees around who haven't learned that yet. As the late summer and going into September, this is when the mosquitoes are really bad. You walk through these meadows in the green swamp, which are different from the meadows outside of the green swamp. These meadows are wet, low nutrient, burn regularly, but they have the most different kinds of flowering plants of anywhere in the temperate zone. And it's all through the season. You've got a parade of Liatris and Rudbeckias and goldenrods and these white things and those pink things and these yellow things. And so insects abound out here for pollination. Here's a Liatris with a tiger swallowtail on it, and there's a Liatris with a Palamedes swallowtail. Liatris spicata subspecies aspera is a subspecies found in pitcher plant bogs. It's the one that has purple. These bracts around the little flower clusters are purple. That's what makes it the bog species of this. So if you want to grow this, you probably need to grow it in something other than a regular flower bed, give it a little extra moisture. But it's fun to watch the butterflies work their way up the stalks. These bloom for weeks. You get a little bit of nectar out of each little tiny flower. This is a flower of the bog vanilla. Used to be called Trellissia. Now it's called Carpiferous. There's another Carpiferous. These are little clusters of flowers. And I love this picture. This is off the internet. It has this beautiful long-tailed skipper butterfly coming here. But here's one of the dangers of visiting flowers. There's always somebody lurking there to jump on you. So these are these green, long-legged spiders called green bog spiders. They're always hanging around flowers, and they eat a certain number of pollinators. So you got to watch out. This is a Gulf Coast fritillary late in the summer visiting the carpiferous flowers that are so abundant in the bogs. Late July into September, some of the most beautiful times in the bogs. Here you got, this is an old copy. It's an old copy of an old slide. But I've still never seen anything quite like it. The array of Platanthera orchids, yellow ones, white ones, hybrids, the liatris, the bog buttons, little things, big things, all blooming at once in the green swamp, and each one is trying to attract pollinator. So each one has its own traits and its own tricks for getting pollinators. Here's your pine lily being pollinated by a butterfly. Remember, lilies are mostly butterfly pollinated, with one exception, and that is the graze lily up in the high mountains. It's hummingbird. But here's a swallowtail going down in here to get nectar, and the pollen right there is going to rub against the wings. These are the orange fringed orchids that are so abundant in the green swamp that have the nectar spurs. All summer long, you've got the spotted horsebalm mint. These showed before, the two lip flowers that bumblebees really love, and many other insects as well. There's just a beehive, no pun intended, pun intended. They're a beehive of activity because you got different bees and other insects visiting them all summer long. Same way with mountain mint. You've got a great array of bees, wasps, flies visiting these flowers. And so there you can just stand there and watch the activity. Here's a mountain mint. This is actually, looks like a wasp, but it's actually a fly. It's only got 2 wings, these 2 little yellow vestigial wings, and they look like they'll sting you, but they won't. That's how they survive, is through mimicry. They love to get nectar, being flies, on these little open flowers here. This is the big-headed fly. I don't know whether it thinks it knows everything or what. Among the last flowers of the year, when you go down, is grass of Parnassus. There's a species in the mountains and 2 species at least on the coast. And they stick their flowers well above the grasses and things that cover the leaves. These are mysterious and enigmatic flowers. They're the lines in the petals of this bowl-shaped flower might imply pollination by flies. The fact that these things that look like pollen stamens are actually fake implies that it's pollinated by a fly. They're easily fooled. Here are the real stamens right around here. And so while bees might visit this once or twice, I think these are fly pollinated, and they're big flowers, and they're wonderful to look at. Difficult to photograph to get the green veins on the white petals, but very much worth seeking in late summer in certain areas of the green swamp and the bogs. One of my favorite flowers are the crow poisons. I don't know why they're called that. Zygodinus. They bloom late in the year on 2-3 foot tall plants. They're in the lily family. These have these golden nectar spots on the petals, which I think actually do produce nectar. You never know these days what's fake nectar and pollen and what's true nectar and pollen, but I believe these actually produce nectar. And so these are visited by fairly large insects, maybe bees, maybe butterflies. They're wonderful to see. They're thick textured and long lasting in the bogs. And so to wrap up, I'm just going to mention a few more wind pollination things to watch for when you're out looking in the spring. Like on this birch, river birch, you'd see down at the coast, the male catkins that hang down and make pollen, and the little female catkins that stick up and have stigmas. These are cross-pollinated by wind and are not showy. And I love to look at walnut and hickory flowers because they're so robust. These are black walnut. These are the male catkins hanging down. You can see the clusters of stamens in there. These are the female stigmas over here. They're oversized to pick up the wind pollinated. Here's a close-up. There's the male stamens hanging in there like bunches of bananas. And the female stigma is quite sticky to catch any pollen that blowing around. This usually happens in the spring. I stuck them in here with other wind pollinated things. So, what does all this mean? Well, one of the lessons, the obvious lesson is as you walk through the woods and the fields and the ditches and the bogs, look at the flowers, begin to notice their differences and realize that their differences are biological differences that have to do with helping them, get through their way of life, shapes, sizes, colors, and textures. It also helps to point out that there's a cooperation between, if you will, between flowers and insects. They're helping each other. The insects get food from the flowers, and the flowers get pollinated. And these pollinators are making choices. The flowers are setting up choices, and the pollinators are making the choices of which flowers they want, what quality, if you will, of pollen or nectar. Similar to the way humans make food choices. And so here you go. When you get off the interstate, you got this whole row of eating places, kind of like flowers. You can choose whether you want to go to this one or that one or that one. They've all got their logos and their colors. They've got their nectar guides. They've got their shapes. They've got their ease of visiting, whether drive-up window or walk in the door. They have their different offerings. Some offer junk, cheap stuff. Some offer more quality stuff. And so you make a choice. And that's, I think, the beauty of understanding this as you walk through the fields, forests, and bogs is it's not just what you see on the surface. It's deeper. It's eons of evolution of animals and plants fitting together, co-evolving, if you will, in their habitats, which is why you can't go out and disturb these places and expect them to recover, or wipe them out and say, well, there's another meadow down the road, you don't need this one. I wish developers didn't have that attitude. Pretty soon is going to be the last passenger pigeon in the zoo, and for some of these plants. And then there's the biological lesson of sex. If you want to go that far, this is where the birds and bees come in. The flowers and the animals are having to solve the very same problem. And that is get cross-fertilized. Egg and sperm have to get together in order to make offspring and make a new generation. And so that's part of what's going on. It's not just fun and games out there with the bees flying around, the butterflies flying around. It's a microcosm. You've got the animals that prey on the pollinators. You've got everybody making a living in this community. And so it's a situation of what I call cooperation and competition. The flowers and the trees need the birds and the bees. They need each other in order to survive. And so that's the ultimate lesson, is you need to realize that and try to protect these fine-tuned ecosystems that we love so much. And the swamplands and the sand hills and the forests or the mountains and everything are examples of those different fine-tuned communities. That's the end. So there's my lesson for you today. Go out and look at nature and make some choices. There are groups of people who are looking more at the butterflies and their special flowers. Will Stewart occasionally tells me of butterflies he's trying to chase down to photograph that we don't know much about, that visit certain rare plants. We don't know much about the behaviors. It would be a good project be a good school project, or even for adults to go out and make observations, they would find it rewarding. The whole notion of pollination biology is fascinating.
Yeah. Those of you that missed the Jeff Pippin and are interested in that, of him starting the butterfly
And Doug Calamy's talks on
Ohio State,
on oaks and other on all the caterpillars that are on oaks, boggles the mind that there's that much diversity, which means more people need to tell us, show us that there's these special things out there, so that folks will learn more as the future goes on.
Well, I thank you so much, Larry.
You're welcome, Charlie. So I know I see people in there. They know there's Chuck, and other folks. I can't see everybody, but thank you all for coming. And I wish I could see you at the Native Plant Picnic, maybe in second Saturday of June here near Charlotte. We'll see how that works out. Be growing some rare plants to bring to the auction.